match this 50's era pine base, I bought D-pine 1x4s at a local lumberyard. After flattening one face of the 1x4s on a joiner and running the pieces through the thickness planer, taking a light pass, you can see the sort of irregularities that come in standard 1x4s. Another pass through the thickness planer, followed by straightening an edge on a joiner, ripping these pieces to width. I ended up with blanks that matched the height and thickness of the existing pine base exactly. Once I have blanks that are the right size, I scribe the front and back profile of the base I'm matching onto the end of a blank to use for setting up the coving, sawing, and routering operations to duplicate the profile. With a little trial and error, I find a spray can that matches the radius on the face of this trim. The first can I try is a little too large and leaves a gap, so I opt for a smaller can that matches the radius precisely and trace it out on the end of the blank. Set up this cove on a table saw. I just need to know the width, the chord of that arc, and then the depth of the arc. Looks like 1 7/16 inches wide and a strong 1/4 inch deep. Sometimes I plan the setup for this coving operation with SketchUp by making a model of what I want to get done, but this time I'm just going to do it the analog way and set the blade depth to the depth of the cove I want to end up with. By adjusting up and down and sneaking up on that depth. We'll start out a little bit low. Once the depth is set, I'll lock in the height so that that blade depth doesn't change during the setup. The next step in the setup is to mark where the blade enters the table at this depth of cut. I can do that by hooking a tooth on the end of a sharp board. As soon as the tooth moves, I know that that is the extent of where the blade enters the table, and I'll do the same thing on this other side to determine where the blade comes out of the table. So I have 2 marks for the blade, and now all I need to do is determine an angle where, when the boards are set up parallel to each other 1 7/16 inches apart, that they line up with these 2 marks. The quickest way I've found to do that is to cut a couple blocks that are exactly the width of the cove. In this case, like I said, 1 7/16 inches. I just want those blocks to nicely match up for the width of my cove. This is easier to explain than it is to show, but with these 2 scraps spaced out the distance of the width of the cove, I want to line up the insides of the scraps with the 2 pencil marks on the table saw throat plate. What I end up with is the angle that the jig needs to be set at to make the cove in the face of the trim. And that's where these pencil marks come in. I'll set up 2 guides, one on each side of this trim blank, that'll carry the piece through at the exact angle to make the cove. I can space out the fences with 2 pieces of the trim blank. I prefer clamps with cushions on their pads for this setup, because I can get a firm hold without damaging any equipment. I like the way that looks overall. I'm going to make a mark on here in case I bump something. I can get back to the angle I want, and then I'll just clamp another fence that's parallel on this other side. It should go without saying that these fences need to be arrow straight and relatively smooth so the wood glides through. I'm happy with my setup. When the marks on the blank follow the pencil marks on the table and the blank slides through snugly but with minimal play. This is where the importance of consistent blanks comes in. So that I can sneak up on the depth and the width of the cove, I'll remember the angle of the depth set control on the table saw so that I can loosen it and drop the blade an even increment and get back to where I was before. The way this is set up, I'll go 1 turn counterclockwise to the same angle, which will give me a repeatable depth of cut. I can go back up in half turns end up here, and I know when I get back here I'll be at the right depth for the cove. That allows me to take a few shallow passes and sneak up on the depth of cove that we ultimately need to end up with. First pass is a little light, so I'm going to raise this up another quarter of a turn. That first pass removes a good portion of the material, but there's still some room to sneak up on the final profile that I'm after. If you have difficulty with the setup, sometimes this cove is off to one side or the other, and you can adjust the fence accordingly because there's enough material left here to sneak up on the final cove profile that we're after. By looking at the end grain and where various knots and defects are in the blanks, I determined that this is going to be the face of the trim. This will be the top edge, and I'm going to cove it right through here just like the sample. So I flip the blanks over so that they feed through the jig in the right orientation. Now that everything's set up, it's a matter of running that cove in 2 or 3 passes. After all the blanks have gone through this fixture one time through, I raise up the blade, not quite to the final setting, and then run it through for a second pass. Looking at the pencil mark and the width of that cove, it's looking pretty sweet. And comparing the blank to the final piece of trim, you can feel a small lip on here. So after I run all the pieces through at the second pass, I'll sneak up just another fraction of a turn to get this as close as possible. After all the blanks have gone through for their second pass, I'm going to raise the blade just shy of the final setting that I made earlier. I like the way that final pass looks and feels, so I'll run the rest of the blanks through at this final setting. On the final pass, I push as steadily, evenly, and slowly as I can, nice and smooth, because I want to minimize any marks from the saw blade on this, which will make for less sanding later. I ended up making one final adjustment to take just a little bit more material off so that I was completely satisfied with the way these curves match up between the new and the old. The next step in this process is to cut this lug off to make the straight face on the trim. And even though it's a simple step, I still need to be precise and methodical in the way I go about cutting that, because it's just as easy to spoil the trim on this step as any other. Even though the wood is soft, smooth, and pretty consistent grain, the stabilizer helps the blade run more smoothly with less chatter and deflection, leaving a smoother cut and less sanding. Using the existing trim to make the setup, I'll set the space between the blade and the fence and the height of the blade to match this profile when I cut off the lug on this blank. In this case, like I often do, I'll take it in a couple of passes to sneak up on the final setting. That's good for a preliminary pass, so I'll run all the blanks through and probably take one more final pass on it, clean it up. During this type of milling operation, it's extremely important to have consistently straight, flat, and smooth blanks. There's a small line here where the top of the saw curve meets the cove, and if there's more than a few thousandths of an inch difference from one blank to the next, the end result might not be acceptable. As I dialed in for a closer match on this trim, I realized that this face isn't perfectly flat. It has a slight angle to it. Pretty minor difference, but as long as I'm making a final pass, I'm going to go ahead and put that slight angle on there for a better match. When the original molding was made, this is all done with a single cutter, and it's easy to grind a 2-degree slightly curving arc for the face of the upper part of the trim, but because I'm matching it with a saw blade, I've got to go about it a little differently. Looks like 3 degrees is going to give a pretty nice match, so I'll test that out on our guinea pig. I like the angle, but it's still a little thick, so I'll sneak this fence over ever so slightly. It's going to be ever so slightly too much. And that's what I call sneaking up on it. I've got the angle and the curve just wonderful. There's a small discrepancy in here between the saw blade and the cove, but that'll be easy enough to take out in the finishing process. So we're going to go with that. Because the thickness is so critical here, if the board flexes, the blade's going to cut in and spoil the trim. So I've gone ahead and put on a feather board to keep the pieces snugly against the fence. Being careful not to put too much pressure on this feather board with my fence setup, because it could actually deflect the fence with too much pressure. Right in between is a happy medium. We'll get a nice consistent cut with less trouble than trying to guide it through by hand. If you're watching closely, you'll notice that this saw is a right tilt setup. It's an old saw. Me and this guy go way back. Most of the newer saws are left tilt, so your setups will be opposite to make some of these angle changes in setup, but the process is the same. It's difficult to feed with this fence setup in this orientation. I ended up stopping as I fed the piece through. Got a couple saw burn marks in here, which is something I try to avoid once in a while. It just happens, and it's easy enough to work around because I've kept it to a minimum. The final step for milling this profile is going to be to match this small radius on the top. By trial and error, eyeballing, I found that an 1/8 inch roundover bit is going to be just right to put that cove on the trim. Because it's difficult to balance a router on such a small edge, I'll just use the guinea pig as a support for the router and then just route the other pieces by pulling them through. And that worked quite nicely to get a matching radius on the top of the trim. Next, I'll set up a dado blade to put this relief in the back side of the trim. Well, I'm quite pleased with the match up to this stage. Matching up the sweep of this molding on our new pieces shouldn't be too big of a challenge, but to speed up the process, I'm going to make a scraping blade out of this old bandsaw blade to get the shape consistent. By spending a few minutes with the grinder and a few files, I was able to match the contour of the existing profile nicely on this piece of an old bandsaw blade. Once the contour is set, just file the faces nice and smooth, and turn an edge on it with the shank of a screwdriver. It raises a nice burr on either side, which will work to shape the contour of the molding. That's a pretty fine matchup. Not bad for a carpenter. I've softened the edges on this and I'll make a quick scraper handle to hold it. In a piece of oak scrap, I made 2 cuts with a thin kerf circular saw blade mounted in a table saw. It's about a 1/16 of an inch cut. So I made 1 cut that was deep enough to give these fingers some flexibility. I made a 2nd cut to put a shoulder inside the block for this blade to index on, and then I'll just put a screw in here to pinch the blade. I'll drill halfway through the block with a 3/16 inch bit. That'll give clearance for the screw. And I'll follow up with a 2nd bit through the 2nd half of the wood to give the screws something to thread into. With any luck, the wood will be enough for these machine screws to thread into. Oh yeah. That'll be perfect. That's going to work out great. Trim these screws off with a hacksaw. This is the part of every custom molding job that helps make the decision between matching a profile with regular shop equipment or getting a custom profile cut for a molding machine. Spent a lot of time matching this profile to the existing trim, but the final steps to round off this little shoulder, take the mill marks out, and clean things up takes quite a bit of time. There's a trade-off between spending the money up front for a molding knife or spending the time afterwards doing the sanding and final touch-up of the trim. Because I made the decision to make this molding using regular shop equipment and not getting a custom ground molding knife, I have an arsenal of tools to do the final cleanup of the molding. And I use these tools in sequence to clean up the various surfaces on the molding so that they're suitable for trim. And the first step is to use the pencil. Just put a light pencil mark on this contour so I have a guideline to follow as I do the other steps. The next step is to use a sharp block plane and take a few passes on this shoulder to remove most of the wood to get the contour to fit this scraper. It's faster to remove the wood with a block plane on that shoulder than with the scraper. With those two steps done, I follow up with the scraper until the cutter and the wood match up. You can see how much material needs to be removed here to make that happen. After the scraper, I use the sanding block on the flat surfaces, clean those up. Then I use a contoured sanding block from the auto body business to sand this curve. This fits nicely in there. It's just a slightly smaller radius than the curve on the trim. That allows me to sand the saw marks out. Then I have another random scraper made out of a piece of tough steel in case there's any shoulders left in the surface of the wood from the saw blade. The generic curve on this scraper can go in and clean up any random saw marks that show up. So I follow up with a piece of 80 grit sandpaper by hand just to clean up anything that these tools don't clean up. And then the final step before putting a coat of primer and paint on here is to finish up with a piece of 120 grit sandpaper to clean out the 80 grit sanding marks from the previous steps. I clamp one end of the wood down to hold the piece in place, and then I begin the steps by drawing light pencil marks in the contour. Next I follow up with a block plane on the shoulder to remove the majority of material so there's less to remove with the scraper. The contour of the scraper is a perfect fit to the molding when it's held vertical to the surface, but to get a scraping action I need to tilt it a little bit. And when I'm tilting it, I found that if I just take short, firm, steady strokes, I can quickly make the profile of the wood match the profile of the scraper. I alternate between pushing and pulling the scraper depending on the direction of the grain in the wood. It doesn't take a whole lot on this soft wood to scrape that profile down to meet the profile on this scraper. If this was a different species of wood that was harder, we'd probably need to spend more time with a tougher piece of steel and get a sharper scraping edge on this to get the job done. The next step is the step I hate the most, sanding. Ugh. But with fresh sandpaper and sharp grit, it's actually not too bad. I work this flat face first to make sure there aren't any mill marks in there. Next I'll do the slight angle flat face here on the trim, and a little trick for that, because we're sanding from a flat into a curve, I slide the sandpaper off the edge of my sanding block slightly so that it goes up onto the tangent of this cove cut. When the pencil marks are gone, I know I'm done with this step. Notice that my sanding strokes are at a slight diagonal, and this diagonal is sort of perpendicular to the saw marks, and that'll remove them the quickest. I can alternate between a diagonal stroke this way and a diagonal stroke that way rather than just following the grain perfectly, and I'll get a quicker job of making this surface flat and level. I want to make sure that this flat surface is blended in to the rough side of that cove to complete this step. Recenter the sandpaper on the block and clean up the top edge and the small radius. It doesn't take much of a stroke on that small radius to put it where it needs to be, since the router bit was so close to the final profile. With 80 grit sandpaper, cleaning up this top edge goes really quick, and it would be easy to overdo and dull down the radius on this top edge. So I'm careful with what I do so I don't go too far with the sanding and spoil the molding. The final sand out the saw blade marks out of this cove, I'll use this curved sanding block with a couple of 80 grit discs on here because it nicely follows the shape of the cove. I use a rolling motion with this block because it'll cut the saw tooth marks out more aggressively. Also helps to blend the cove into the flat, keeps the sandpaper clean, etc. And I keep after it until those diagonal saw blade marks are completely out of there. Sharp sandpaper, the right shape of a sanding block, and a little bit of elbow grease actually make pretty quick work of this step. Alright, I'm happy with that. The saw tooth marks are gone. I'm going to take the flat sanding block and roll this shoulder over just ever so slightly to get the chatter marks from the scraper out of it. And you can be glad you're the one doing the watching and I'm doing the sanding. Here again, it'd be easy to overdo and make this shoulder too round, so I approach this step with caution so I don't spoil the molding here at the finish line. I can always check the profile with our scraper to make sure that everything is coming out smooth and even. Once the sawtooth marks are out of there and I'm happy with the match of the profile, the final step will be to follow up with some 120 grit sandpaper to smooth out the 80 grit sanding marks. And that right there is how I spend the afternoon getting covered with sawdust and matching the profile of this base molding on 30 linear feet of new pine trim. So I hope this video gives you some ideas of things that can be done using standard shop tools in creative ways to duplicate moldings that are no longer available at a local lumberyard, especially when the quantity doesn't justify the cost of a custom molding cutter. If I've done my homework right, all it takes is a quick coat of primer followed by a finished coat of paint, and this new trim will be as good as old.